On the outside, the Crumbleys looked like any other suburban American family hard-working parents. A quiet teenage son, a small home in Michigan, weekend trips to the shooting range, and smiling photos posted online. But behind that picture of normal life, something was quietly, steadily going wrong. In 4 days after a new hand entered their home, their son Ethan would walk into Oxford High School and open fire, creating a tragedy that prosecutors later said could have been stopped not by teachers, not by counselors, but by the two people who should have seen him most clearly, his parents. To the people who knew him, Ethan Crumbley seemed shy and polite, a boy who liked to draw, who kept to himself, who spent hours lost in video games. But in the last days of November 2021, teachers began noticing disturbing changes. They caught him watching bullet videos in class, sketching images of guns, bleeding figures and phrases like, "The thoughts won't stop, help me." When the school contacted Jennifer Crumbley, hoping for a concerned parent's response, she texted Ethan instead, writing, "LOL, I'm not mad at you. You have to learn not to get caught." That same weekend, James Crumbley bought a 6-hour 9mm surveillance video showed Ethan standing right beside him, and Jennifer proudly took her son to a shooting range, posting a picture of the weapon with a cheerful caption. What looked like family bonding was, in hindsight, the beginning of a countdown. On the morning of November 30th, 2021, Ethan rode to school with his father. Inside his backpack was the pistol. At around 10 a.m., a teacher found another violent drawing on his desk. Bullets, a gun, a bleeding figure, and more desperate words. The school immediately called James and Jennifer in for an emergency meeting. Counselors told them plainly that Ethan needed urgent mental health help. They urged the parents to take him home, but both refused, saying they had to get back to work. No one checked Ethan's backpack. No one knew the gun was inside, and so the school, unable to force the issue, sent Ethan back to class. At 12:51 p.m., he stood up, walked into a hallway, and opened fire. 4 students, Tate Meyer, Madison Baldwin, Hannah Street Juliana, and Justin Schilling were killed. 7 others were wounded. As news broke, Jennifer texted her son, "Ethan, don't do it." Then she messaged her husband, "Ethan might be the shooter." James rushed home, found the gun missing, and called 911. In the days that followed, investigators uncovered a devastating pattern. The gun had been stored in an unlocked drawer. Ammunition was freely accessible. Text messages, school emails, and Ethan's own journal entries revealed that he had begged for help his parents never provided. Oakland County prosecutors made an unprecedented decision. They charged James and Jennifer Crumbley with 4 counts each of involuntary manslaughter, arguing that their negligence directly enabled the massacre. It was the first time in American history that parents were held criminally responsible for a school shooting committed by their own child. The trials drew national attention. Prosecutors presented evidence showing warning signs ignored again and again. The defense insisted that the parents were scapegoats for an unthinkable act, but the juries disagreed. In early 2024, Jennifer was found guilty. 2 months later, James was convicted of the same charges. Both were sentenced to serve up to 15 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 10. The judge called their failure a tragic example of reckless disregard for human life. Their son Ethan, who had pleaded guilty to 24 charges including first-degree murder and terrorism, received life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 24 additional years. As of late 2025, he remains in a Michigan correctional facility. His parents sit in 2 others, less than an hour away. 3 lives, 3 prisons, 1 tragedy that reshaped how America sees the responsibilities of gun-owning parents. A story of warning signs unheeded, of cries for help unanswered, and of a catastrophe that didn't begin the day the shots were fired, but days, weeks, even months before. If Bonnie and Clyde had lived long enough to raise a child, they might have looked like Sante and Kenneth Kimes. But this family didn't rob banks in a haze of gunfire. They committed their crimes slowly, deliberately, wrapped in charm, luxury, and lies. They drifted through life like wealthy ghosts, leaving behind forged signatures, stolen identities, torched houses, and eventually, a missing woman whose body was never found. Their son, Kenny, didn't grow up learning right from wrong. He grew up learning whatever served his mother. Sante Kimes was born in 1,934 inches, Oklahoma, but she began reinventing herself the moment she left. In every city she touched, she changed her story. First, she was a beauty, then a businesswoman, and eventually a manipulator whose confidence was her weapon. She could charm her way into anyone's trust and walk away with their money, their property, or their life shattered. Her husband, Kenneth Sr., was the perfect counterpart, polished, well-spoken, educated, and willing to play the straight man in every one of her scams. Together, they lived like jet setters. But underneath the designer clothes and luxury hotels was a relentless hunger for control. In 1978, Sante's cruelty caught up with her when she was convicted of enslaving a housekeeper in Los Angeles. She beat the woman, forced her to work without pay, and kept her trapped until the police intervened. She served just over 3 years. When she walked out of prison, she didn't soften, she sharpened. Their son Kenny was born in 1975 into a world where lies were normal and morality didn't exist. To Sante, motherhood wasn't nurturing, it was training. She homeschooled him, not with math and reading, but with lessons and manipulation. How to forge signatures, how to fake accents, how to study a person's weaknesses and use them. She called it the art of persuasion. Kenny didn't grow into his own identity, he grew into hers. When Kenneth Sr. died in 1994, most families would grieve. Sante saw freedom, no more breaks, no more compromises. She and Kenny began drifting again, 2 people, 30 identities, dozens of scams. They lived in 5-star hotels under fake names, conned wealthy strangers, defrauded property owners, and set buildings on fire for insurance payouts. Their crimes took them across the Bahamas, Hawaii, the mainland United States. Sometimes they claimed to be film producers, sometimes diplomats, sometimes wealthy investors. Everything was a lie, except for the bond between mother and son, a bond built not on love, but on obedience. By 1998, they had arrived in New York, and their new target was Irene Silverman, an 82-year-old former Radio City Rockette who owned a multi-million-dollar townhouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Irene was elegant, sharp, and independent, but she also lived alone. Using forged IDs, Sante and Kenny rented a room in her mansion under the names Manny and Eva Guerin. Within days, Sante was forging Irene's signature on property deeds, trying to steal not just her identity but her home. But Irene wasn't the type to be fooled easily. She noticed their strange behavior, their evasive answers, their refusal to provide references. She started keeping notes about them. And on July 5th, 1998, she confronted them. That same night, she vanished. 2 days later, on July 7th, police stopped the Kimes Lincoln Town car in Atlantic City. What they found inside looked like the inventory of a spy film. Wigs, latex gloves, forged passports, a stun gun, $30,000 in cash, and a folder labeled Irene Silverman, her name underlined twice. In their hotel room, detectives found more handcuffs, equipment for making fake IDs, and property documents already bearing Irene's forged signature. Kenny eventually confessed to police, saying he had helped his mother hold Irene down while Sante smothered her with a plastic bag. Later, he recanted. The truth remains buried, just like Irene's body, which has never been found. The 2000 Manhattan trial became a media spectacle. Sante sauntered into court in expensive suits, denying everything and mocking prosecutors. Kenny sat beside her, pale and exhausted, still trapped in his mother's orbit. Prosecutors called them a mother-son crime empire. The defense portrayed Kenny as a brainwashed child who never escaped his mother's psychological grip. The jury saw through both of them. They were convicted of murder, kidnapping, and fraud, sentenced to life without parole. Even behind bars, Sante tried to control Kenny, writing him letters, directing appeals, promising that someday they would win. In October 2000, during a jailhouse interview, Kenny proved the cycle wasn't broken. When a court TV reporter sat down across from him, he suddenly grabbed a pen, pressed it to her throat, and held her hostage for more than 4 hours, demanding that his mother be moved to face trial with him. The standoff ended peacefully, but it showed the world exactly what Sante had created: a son who didn't know where she ended and he began. Sante Kimes died in 2014 at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, unrepentant to the end. Kenny remains in prison, serving multiple life sentences. In interviews, he has called his mother both a genius and a monster. Sometimes he smiles when he says the words, because in the end, Sante didn't just raise a son, she built a weapon crafted in her own image. Before their faces appeared on every television in America, The Menendez family looked almost unreal in their perfection. The mansion on Elm Drive in Beverly Hills was immaculate white stucco, trimmed hedges, the kind of home that whispered success. Inside lived a father who had risen from nothing to become a powerful entertainment executive, a mother who once dazzled as a beauty queen, and two sons who drove luxury cars, wore designer clothes, and seemed destined for elite colleges. But behind those perfect walls was a world built on fear, control, and silence. Jose Menendez ruled his home the same way he ran his career, with absolute authority. He demanded excellence, punished mistakes, and believed obedience was love. For his sons, Eric and Lyle, childhood was a maze of expectations and threats. They were yelled at, humiliated, hit for the smallest misstep. What looked like discipline to the outside world was, inside the house, a systematic crushing of spirit. And the darkness didn't stop there. Jose's abuse crossed every boundary. He sexually assaulted Eric for years, behind closed doors, behind the facade of a successful household that neighbors admired. Eric slept with a knife under his pillow. Lyle planned to run away more than once, but never found the courage. Their mother, Kitty, dissolved inside her own misery, numbing herself with pills and alcohol. She drifted through the house in a haze, unable to defend her sons, unable to confront her husband, unable to face what was happening. By 1989, the brothers were suffocating under a pressure no one else could see. When they attempted to confront their father about the abuse, the situation didn't get better. It got terrifying. They believed Jose was planning to kill to protect his reputation. Whether that fear was real or imagined, it became the fuse that ignited everything. On the night of the 20th of August 1989, Jose and Kitty were watching television in the den. Eric and Lyle walked in holding two 12-gauge guns they had purchased in San Diego days earlier. Moments later, both parents were dead. Jose shot point blank, Kitty attempting to flee before the boys again. The alarm was off. There were no signs of a break-in. The killers hadn't come from outside. They had come from the upstairs hallway. At first, detectives considered a mob hit. Jose's business world was cutthroat, and the idea seemed possible. But that theory fell apart quickly. What didn't fall apart was the brothers' behavior. In the weeks that followed, they went on extravagant spending sprees. Rolex watches, designer suits, travel, luxury restaurants, even a restaurant in Princeton. Nearly $700,000 gone within months. It didn't look like grief. It looked like celebration. They insisted they had been at the movies the night of the murders. They cried at the funeral, but behind closed doors they partied, shopped, laughed. There wasn't enough evidence to arrest them until the truth surfaced in a place no one expected. Eric, racked with guilt, confessed everything during therapy sessions with a psychologist named Dr. Jerome Oziel. Oziel secretly recorded the conversations. When his mistress, Judalon Smith, discovered the tapes, she took them straight to the police. Within weeks, Lyle was arrested. Eric, who had left for Israel out of fear, returned voluntarily and was arrested as well. The trials that followed divided the country. Prosecutors painted the brothers as spoiled heirs who for a $14 million inheritance. The defense argued it was pure survival after years of physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. On the stand, the brothers described a life that sounded more like entrapment than privilege. They didn't cry. They shook. They whispered. They relived horrors that no child should ever carry. But the prosecution pushed back. The purchases, the premeditation, the reloading of the guns. Assistant District Attorney Pamela Bozanich told the jury this wasn't self-defense. It was elimination. She believed the abuse claims were exaggerated, convenient, a strategy, nothing more. The first trial, broadcast across the nation, ended in a hung jury for both brothers. America split into two groups, those who believed they were calculating and those who believed they were traumatized sons. The second trial was closed to cameras and stripped of most testimony about the abuse. This time, the outcome was decisive. In 1996, both Eric and Lyle were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. For years, they were seen as symbols of greed, but slowly, public opinion shifted. Therapists' notes, letters, and new interviews confirmed abuse that had once been dismissed. The story no longer felt like two rich boys killing money. It felt like two broken young men making the worst possible choice in a home where choices had disappeared long ago. Separated for more than 20 years, the brothers were finally reunited in 2018 at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in California. When they saw each other again, they hugged and cried, clinging to the only person who had lived the same nightmare. "We were a family with secrets," Eric later said. "Secrets that destroyed us." As of November 2025, Lyle is 57 and Eric is 54. Both remain in prison, still at the center of a debate that refuses to die. Were they cold-blooded killers or victims whose cries for help were ignored until it was too late? Before the world knew their last name, before the smoke and chaos of Boylston Street, the Zarnievs looked like any immigrant family trying to rebuild their lives in America. Enzor and Zubaidat had fled the instability of Dagestan and Chechnya in the early 2000s, desperate for safety, for stability, for a chance to give their two sons a future without fear. They settled in a cramped Cambridge apartment filled with the smell of home cooking, the sound of two languages, and the quiet hope that this country would deliver on its promises. For a while, it did. Anzor found work as a mechanic. Zubaidat took beauty courses and eventually opened a small skincare business. Their sons thrived, at least on the surface. Tamerlan, tall, charismatic, and gifted, was the pride of the family. A talented boxer with Olympic ambitions, he dreamed of representing the United States in the ring. His younger brother, Dzhokhar, 8 years behind him, blended effortlessly into American life. A good student, a wrestler, a friend to almost everyone. Teachers remembered him as warm and easygoing. He even had a nickname, Jahar. To outsiders, they were proof that the American dream could work. But inside the family, fractures were forming silent at first, then widening year by year. Anzor's health began to fail. His hands shook. His work slowed. He grew quiet, defeated, watching the family he uprooted slowly slip out of his control. Into that vacuum stepped Zubaidat. At one time, she had been enthusiastic about the opportunities in America, but something began to change. She spent more and more time online, diving into anti-Western conspiracy theories and rigid religious videos that promised clarity in a confusing world. What started as curiosity turned into doctrine. She began preaching at the dinner table about corruption, about moral decay, about America betraying its own values. Her sons listened. One listened too deeply. For Tamerlan, whose Olympic dreams collapsed due to new citizenship requirements, the shift was devastating. His identity had revolved around success, competition, pride. When that was taken from him, the void filled with bitterness. He stopped training, withdrew from friends, and started consuming extremist content. He found a new purpose, not in victory rings or trophies, but in ideology, and his mother supported every step. They fed each other's beliefs, amplifying them, validating them, radicalizing together behind closed doors. Dzhokhar watched all of this quietly. He adored his older brother. He followed him everywhere, mimicked him, idolized him. And when Tamerlan's worldview darkened, Dzhokhar was pulled in too, not through force, but through loyalty. In 2011, Russian authorities even warned the US that Tamerlan might be radicalizing, but nothing concrete happened. And by the time anyone looked again, the trajectory was already locked. In 2012, Zubaidat and Anzor returned to Dagestan, claiming they missed home. In truth, they were retreating from financial struggles, from legal trouble, from a life they felt slipping out of control. The two sons remained behind, their paths drifting further into the shadows. On April 15th, 2013, at 2:49 p.m., the Boston Marathon, the symbol of endurance and unity, became the stage for a tragedy. 2 homemade pressure cooker bombs packed with nails and ball bearings exploded near the finish line. 3 people were killed. More than 260 were injured. Surveillance footage quickly revealed the suspects. 2 brothers walking through the crowd with backpacks, calm, ordinary, almost invisible. 4 days later, after murdering MIT police officer Sean Collier and hijacking a car, the brothers were cornered in Watertown. A massive gunfight erupted in the streets. Tamerlan was shot and then run over by Dzhokhar as he tried to flee. Hours later, bleeding, hiding inside a boat in someone's backyard, Dzhokhar was captured. And then came the reaction from their parents, shockingly detached from reality. Zubaidat insisted her sons were innocent, angels, victims of a government conspiracy. She said America had stolen her children. She refused every fact, every piece of evidence, every confession. Anzor sobbed through interviews, repeating, "They couldn't have done this, not my boys." Torn between grief and denial, they eventually returned to Dagestan, where they remain, surrounded by people who echo their disbelief. In 2015, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was convicted on every count, sentenced to death. The sentence was briefly overturned in 2020, then reinstated in 2022. Today, at 31 years old, he sits in ADX Florence, the highest security federal prison in the United States. He has expressed regret for the victims in court, but never once disavowed his brother's ideology. The bombs that tore through the marathon crowd were built from metal fragments and explosive powder. But the true detonation happened much earlier at a dinner table in Cambridge, where hope slowly gave way to anger, where faith twisted into fury, and where love became obedience to an ideology that destroyed everything in its path. Long before Hollywood turned his name into myth, long before Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the Silence of the Lambs borrowed pieces of his darkness, Ed Gein was simply a quiet, lonely farm boy living on the outskirts of Plainfield, Wisconsin. People who knew him would later say he seemed harmless odd, yes, but gentle. What no one could see was that the terror associated with his name didn't begin in his barn or his basement. It began at his dinner table, under the voice of a mother who ruled with scripture, guilt, and fear. Ed's father, George Gein, was a bitter, heavy-drinking man who drifted from job to job, unable to provide, unable to control his temper, unable to escape the disappointment that seemed to define him. His wife, Augusta, was the opposite, domineering, puritanical, and consumed by a fanatical religious worldview. She believed the world was rotten with sin, especially women. Every night, she sat her two sons, Henry and Ed, at the table and read them passages about death, judgment, and damnation. She warned them that women were agents of the devil, corrupting forces whose touch would drag them to hell. Ed absorbed every word like gospel. Augusta wasn't just his mother. She became his definition of morality, purity, and truth. Henry, the older brother, wasn't as blind. As he grew up, he began to resist Augusta's suffocating control, warning Ed that their mother's grip was poisonous. But Ed refused to hear it. He lived for Augusta's approval, and the idea that she could be wrong felt impossible. George died in 1940, freeing Augusta from the one person who occasionally challenged her. The family grew even more isolated. And then, in 1944, everything shifted. A brush fire broke out on their property. When firefighters arrived, Ed claimed he had lost track of Henry. That night, they found Henry's body lying face down in an unburned patch of land, with strange bruises on his head. The coroner called it an accident. Plainfield whispered otherwise. Henry's death removed the last obstacle between Ed and his mother. 1 year later, Augusta died after a stroke. For Ed, it was the collapse of his world. He boarded up her bedroom and left it untouched, spotless, preserved like a shrine while the rest of the farmhouse decayed into filth. Alone on the property, he drifted into a life of isolation and obsession. He read anatomy books and pulp magazines, fixating on images of corpses, body parts, and the female form. He stopped caring for himself. He stopped caring for the house. He slept next to a wood stove, surrounded by trash, tools, and the remnants of his mother's once rigid order. Then he began walking into Plainfield Cemetery at night, carrying a lantern and a shovel. He dug up recently buried women who reminded him of Augusta. He brought their remains home. Over the next decade, Ed transformed the farmhouse into something between a tomb and a workshop. He tanned skin, shaped bones, and crafted objects that defied imagination. These weren't trophies. They were attempts to reconstruct the woman he worshipped and feared. On the 16th of November 1957, hardware store owner Bernice Worden disappeared. Blood was found on the floor. A receipt for antifreeze pointed investigators to Ed's farm. What they found inside stunned hardened officers. Bernice hung in the shed, decapitated, gutted. But the horrors inside the house were even worse. Chairs upholstered in human skin, bowls carved from skulls, masks made from women's faces, boxes of preserved organs, a belt woven from human nipples. In drawers, painted female parts carefully arranged. And in a paper bag, Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had vanished years earlier. When police questioned Ed, he spoke calmly, almost politely. He admitted to killing Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. The rest, he said, came from the graveyard. When detectives asked why he had done it, his answer chilled them. "I was making a woman's suit," he said softly, "so I could become my mother." Psychiatrists later described him as a man emotionally trapped in childhood, unable to separate love from obedience, guilt from desire, grief from madness. Declared legally insane, Ed was committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, later transferred to Mendota Mental Health Institute. Staff said he was quiet, childlike, compliant, nothing like the monster the world imagined. He painted, he read, he talked about Augusta as if she were still alive. Ed Gein died in 1984 at the age of 77, buried beside his mother in Plainfield Cemetery, the same ground he once dug up in the dead of night. His gravestone was stolen years later, leaving nothing but dirt and memories. The farmhouse, that museum of horrors, was burned to the ground by locals shortly after his arrest. Today, only photographs and police reports remain. Ed Gein didn't invent evil. He grew it day by day, under the shadow of a woman who taught him the world was wicked and that she was the only source of purity. Hollywood gave him legend. But the real story, the quiet boy who worshipped his mother until the rest of the world stopped looking human, is far more disturbing. When investigators first sat Henry Lee Lucas down and asked him how many people he'd killed, he leaned back, smiled, and said, hundreds, maybe 1,000. It was a number that shifted every time he opened his mouth, an ever-growing claim from a man who couldn't stop lying except about one thing, the nightmare he grew up in. Before Henry became one of America's most confusing and infamous killers, he was a child raised in a home that seemed designed to break him long before he broke anyone else. Henry was born in August 1936 inches a shack in Blacksburg, Virginia, the youngest of 9 children in a home without plumbing, electricity, or safety. His father, Anderson No Legs Lucas, had lost both legs in a train accident and drowned his despair in alcohol. His mother, Viola, was violent, cruel, and worked as a sex worker, often bringing clients home, forcing her children to watch, and beating them when they turned away. In Henry's earliest memories, there was no love. Only anger, humiliation, and the constant lesson that pain was normal. Viola singled Henry out in particular. She shaved his head as punishment. She forced him to wear girls' clothing to school to shame him. When he tried to make friends, she beat him. When he made eye contact with a girl, she whipped him. He smelled of stale alcohol from the filth of their home, and classmates mocked him relentlessly. To survive, he learned to disappear into barns, into abandoned sheds, into the woods. By age 10, he was already running away regularly, sleeping wherever he could, scavenging for food. His father tried to protect him in the limited ways he could, but illness, poverty, and his disability gave him little power. One freezing winter night, Anderson passed out drunk outside their shack. Henry found him the next morning, frozen to death. Viola didn't grieve. She cursed him for leaving her alone. With his father gone, her tyranny intensified. When Henry injured his eye in a fight with his brother, Viola refused medical treatment, and the infection spread until he lost the eye completely. By his teens, he turned to drinking, stealing, drifting, anything to escape her. But every escape led him right back to her doorstep. Every time he returned, she punished him harder. By 1960, Henry was 23 years old and living with Viola again in a decaying Michigan cabin. Their relationship had never been anything but violent, but now it was explosive. She hated his drinking. She hated his girlfriends. She hated any sign that he might leave her behind. One night, after Henry brought another woman home, Viola attacked him with a broom. Years of rage, trauma, and twisted loyalty snapped. He grabbed a knife and stabbed her in the neck. When police arrived, Henry confessed without hesitation. "I guess I'm glad," he said. "She's not hitting me anymore." He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20-40 years in prison. But in one of the strangest turns in the story, he was released after just 10 years for good behavior. Henry had been raised in a house where cruelty was love and silence was survival prison, felt predictable by comparison. After his release in 1970, Henry drifted through the South, picking up odd jobs, stealing cars, getting arrested, disappearing, resurfacing somewhere else. And then he met Otis Toole, a drifter with a past almost as dark as his own. They became inseparable, two broken men who drank, stole, and fed each other's darkest fantasies. Otis bragged about killing people. Henry exaggerated his own stories. They fed off each other, encouraging, embellishing, twisting truth and fiction until neither knew the difference. Soon, Henry wasn't just telling stories, he was confessing to hundreds of murders. Detectives from across the country lined up to interview him. Some fed him case details without realizing it. Others wanted the publicity of solving cold cases. Henry soaked up the attention like oxygen. Every new confession made him important. Every new number made him powerful. By 1983, he was claiming more than 600 kills. But the truth was much smaller and much more tragic. Forensic evidence eventually proved that most of his confessions were impossible. He was in the wrong state, the wrong job, or even in jail when some murders occurred. The legend collapsed. Dozens of cases were reopened. The task force built around his expertise dissolved in embarrassment. The man once called America's most prolific serial killer turned out to be a compulsive liar. A damaged man who learned early that people only listened when he shocked them. Still, some of his crimes were real. He murdered his girlfriend, Becky Powell. He murdered an elderly woman named Kate Rich. He was convicted in both cases, and he was sentenced to death for the murder of an unidentified woman known as Orange Socks, a conviction later overturned by DNA evidence. In 1998, Texas Governor George W. Bush commuted his death sentence to life. In his final years, Henry faded into obscurity in a Texas prison. He painted. He read the Bible. He gave interviews that swung wildly between remorse and pride. He took back some confessions. He doubled down on others. But he never retracted the one killing no one doubted the murder of his mother. For all the lies he told, that truth was the one he never tried to escape. Henry Lee Lucas died of heart failure in 2001 at the age of 64. By then, he had become less a serial killer than a mirror reflecting the consequences of a childhood where cruelty was constant and chaos was home. The boy who grew up in hell never learned how to tell the difference between horror and attention, and by the time the world stopped listening, he was already too far gone. In the summer of 1968, the people of Newcastle upon Tyne were living in the hard, gray rhythm of a working-class city's shipyards. Soot, narrow streets filled with unsupervised children playing among broken glass and abandoned buildings. But no one imagined that among those roaming children was a one-year-old girl who would soon commit acts that shocked Britain. A girl who smiled sweetly, lied with ease, and carried a darkness that had been planted inside her long before she ever laid hands on another child. Her name was Mary Bell. Mary was born on the 26th of May 1957 into a home already spiraling. Her mother, Betty, was only 16, still a child herself, addicted to alcohol and desperate for attention. Her father disappeared shortly after Mary's birth, replaced by a string of violent men. Eventually, Betty married a petty criminal named Billy Bell, known for burglary and bar fights. Together, they created an environment shaped by chaos, neglect, and cruelty. Neighbors later said Betty openly admitted she never wanted Mary. She told friends she had attempted to abort her and more than once had tried to suffocate the infant. Relatives intervened just in time. As Mary grew older, Betty's abuse changed shape. Betty was involved in sex work and, horrifyingly, began offering Mary to men. By the time Mary was in school, teachers described her as distant, aggressive, detached. She lied compulsively. She bullied smaller children. She seemed fascinated by danger and pain, almost entertained by it. When other kids were asked what they wanted to be when they grew up, they named firefighters or teachers. Mary said she wanted to be a nurse, so I can hurt people. In May 1968, just days before Mary's 11th birthday, her inner darkness surfaced for the first time. She and her friend, 3-year-old Norma Bell, no relation, lured a 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown into an abandoned house. Inside, Mary shot him. The act wasn't quick. It wasn't impulsive rage. It was curiosity, control, the twisted behavior of a child shaped by chaos. When police found Martin's body, there were no obvious signs of violence. They assumed it was an accident. But days later, staff at a nearby nursery discovered the building had been vandalized. Scattered among the debris was a handwritten note, childish letters scrawled across paper. "We did Martin Brown." Police dismissed it as a sick prank. They were wrong. 2 months later, on the 31st of July 1968, 3-year-old Brian Howe disappeared. His body was found in an empty lot, strangled, hair roughly cut with scissors, his legs scratched, and the letter M carved into his stomach. This time, the brutality was unmistakable. Investigators began interviewing children in the area. When they questioned Mary, something about her calmness felt wrong. She smiled as she spoke. She mentioned Brian's injuries, details the police had not released. She told a story about seeing Brian with another child who might have had scissors. Her tone was casual, almost pleased with herself. That slip was enough. Witnesses' children Mary had bragged came forward. Soon, Mary and Norma were arrested. Mary showed no remorse. When police explained the charges, she shrugged and said, "That's all right by me." She accused Norma of lying. She said Norma was the real killer. But other children told a different story. Mary had confessed privately. She described the murders in chilling detail, as if she were repeating something that fascinated her rather than something she regretted. At trial, psychologists testified that Mary was highly intelligent but deeply disturbed. The signs of trauma were everywhere, psychopathy rooted in chronic, severe abuse. Norma, who was seen as more impressionable and less aware, was acquitted. Mary was found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The judge called the case extraordinary and tragic, acknowledging that Mary had never truly been given a chance at a normal life. Mary was sentenced to detention at Her Majesty's pleasure, an indefinite term. In custody, she received therapy for the first time in her life. She learned to read properly, studied art, began to show signs small, fragile of empathy. Over years, she changed. She grew. She matured. But she never fully escaped what she had done. In 1980, at age 23, Mary Bell was released. The public was outraged. She was hunted by the press, stalked by tabloids, forced into hiding. In 2003, a court granted lifelong anonymity to Mary and her daughter, who had been born after Mary's release. They live under assumed names, a rare protection, acknowledging that while Mary committed terrible acts, she was also a child who had never been protected from the horrors inflicted upon her. As of November 2025, Mary Bell would be 68 years old, living quietly somewhere in the United Kingdom. A woman who once had children when she herself was only a child, 2 tragedies intertwined, 2 lives stolen, long before the world ever learned her name. Long before California knew him as the Night Stalker, long before the pentagrams, the headlines, and the terror that swept across Los Angeles, Richard Ramirez was just a quiet boy growing up in El Paso. Texas, a boy shaped by violence long before he ever inflicted it. The monster that would one day climb through bedroom windows didn't spring from nowhere. He was built, piece by brutal piece, inside a family that taught him fear, chaos, and cruelty, as if they were ordinary parts of life. Richard was born on the 29th of February 1960, the youngest of 5 children. His father, Julian, was a strict, unpredictable man, an immigrant who worked hard for the Santa Fe Railroad but carried rage like a second skin. Neighbors heard the shouting from their small home, heard the snaps of his belt against his children, heard Mercedes, Richard's soft-spoken mother, trying to hold the family together while carrying her own pain. She had worked in a boot factory during her pregnancies, exposed to toxic fumes that may have harmed her unborn children. By the time Richard arrived, the family was already strained, financially, emotionally, spiritually. Richard's childhood was a string of injuries and instability. At age 2, a dresser fell on his head, knocking him unconscious. At 5, he was struck by a swing and suffered another severe head injury. Afterward, he experienced seizures, quiet episodes where the world slipped out of his control. He grew withdrawn, timid, drifting through school like a ghost. He was bullied, neglected, terrified of his father's temper. Some nights he slept in cemeteries or on neighbors' porches to escape the violence at home. And then came the moment that changed everything, the moment he met his cousin Miguel. Miguel Mike Ramirez was a decorated Green Beret who had returned from Vietnam with more than medals. He carried Polaroids of the women he assaulted and killed overseas. He shared these photos with 2-year-old Richard, describing the acts with pride, laughing at death as if it were a joke. For a troubled child desperately seeking a role model, Mike became one. Richard idolized him. These weren't lessons in morality, they were lessons in domination, cruelty, and power. And then, one night, Mike snapped. After an argument with his wife, he pulled out a gun and shot her in the face right in front of Richard. Mike was arrested, found insane, and committed. But the damage was irreversible. Whatever innocence Richard had left was gone. Violence had stopped being frightening. It had become familiar. As Richard entered his teens, he slipped deeper into darkness. He began breaking into homes, stealing, experimenting with drugs. Teachers described him as polite but empty, a boy whose emotions had been switched off. His home life offered no refuge. His father's beatings continued. His siblings drifted away. And the one man he admired most, the man who taught him to equate violence with strength, was locked in a psychiatric hospital. By 17, Richard dropped out of school and drifted west, landing in Los Angeles. There, he lived on the streets, addicted to cocaine, breaking into houses at night to steal cash, jewelry, anything he could find. He also devoured books on Satanism, creating a belief system that combined the fear of his childhood with the cruelty he had witnessed. Evil, to him, became freedom. In 1984, the transformation became complete. Richard Ramirez began breaking into homes in the dead of night, attacking victims at random. His crimes were chaotic: young, old, rich, poor, couples, children, anyone. There was no pattern except brutality. He raped, beat, tortured, murdered. He left pentagrams on walls. He whispered, "Hail Satan," into terrified ears. The media called him the Walking, then the Night Stalker. Los Angeles locked its doors, boarded its windows, and slept in fear, waiting to hear breaking glass in the dark. Ramirez fed off the panic. He read newspaper articles about himself. He bragged to acquaintances. He believed he was untouchable. But on the 31st of August 1985, the public ended his reign of terror. After police released his photo, a group of residents in East Los Angeles recognized him and chased him down, beating him until officers arrived. In his pocket was a pentagram drawn in ink. In his eyes, witnesses later said, there was nothing. His trial was a spectacle. Ramirez smiled at cameras, flashed the pentagram carved into his palm, shouted, "Hail Satan," as the verdict was read. He seemed to enjoy the attention, as if the courtroom were a stage created just for him. He was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and multiple burglaries. In 1989, he was sentenced to death. His response was chillingly casual. Big deal, death always went with the territory. Richard spent more than 2 decades on death row at San Quentin. He received fan mail, marriage proposals, and media fascination. Even in prison, he remained an icon of horror. But beneath the myth, beneath the satanic theatrics and the courtroom performances, the truth was simpler and more disturbing. The Night Stalker wasn't born in a ritual or a dark alley. He was created in a small Texas home by a father who taught fear, a mother who couldn't protect him, and a cousin who taught him to admire cruelty. Richard Ramirez died in 2013 from lymphoma at the age of 53. He never expressed true remorse. And perhaps he never understood that the monster the world saw in him was one he had been taught to become long before he ever took a life. When people hear the name Jeffrey Dahmer, they think of the gruesome details, the freezer, the photographs, the unimaginable horrors discovered inside a small apartment in Milwaukee. But long before he became one of history's most infamous serial killers, Jeffrey Dahmer was a lonely boy growing up inside a home filled with quiet dysfunction, unspoken resentments, and emotional voids that widened year after year. His parents weren't killed. They were ordinary people trapped in a collapsing marriage, too consumed by their own pain to see how their silence was slowly shaping a disaster. Jeffrey was born on the 21st of May 1960 in Milwaukee. His father, Lionel, was a hard-working chemistry student, logical, meticulous, and emotionally distant. His mother, Joyce, was volatile, depressed, and dependent on prescription drugs. Throughout her pregnancy, she took medications obsessively. After Jeffrey was born, she often stayed in bed for long stretches, overwhelmed by anxiety and physical ailments. Lionel, consumed by school and multiple jobs, wasn't home much. What this meant was that Jeffrey spent his earliest years largely on his own, in a house where neither parent had the emotional stability to truly see him. Family friends remembered Jeffrey as a quiet, painfully shy child. He rarely cried. He rarely demanded attention. It was as if he learned early that drawing notice only brought chaos. In 1966, the Dahmers moved to Bath Township, Ohio, into what looked like a typical suburban home. But inside, the fighting worsened. Joyce's mental health continued to deteriorate. She accused Lionel of not caring. Lionel accused her of being irrational. The arguments were thunderous, relentless. Jeffrey watched everything from the sidelines, silently absorbing the tension, the bitterness, the discomfort. Somewhere during these years, Jeffrey developed a fascination with death. While other children collected baseball cards, he collected roadkill. He would bike the rural roads, pick up dead animals, and dissect them in a shed behind the house. Lionel, being a chemist, thought it might be scientific curiosity. But Jeffrey wasn't studying anatomy. He wasn't experimenting. He was examining control over bodies that couldn't reject him, couldn't leave, couldn't demand love he didn't know how to give. At school, Jeffrey seemed invisible. He sat at the back of classrooms, rarely speaking, rarely interacting, drifting through life like a shadow. His parents' fights escalated until Joyce attempted suicide, something Jeffrey witnessed in the quiet, shell-shocked way children do when they have nowhere to place their fear. He began drinking heavily by age 14, sneaking beer and liquor into class. Teachers noticed the smell but missed the desperation behind it. By 1978, the Dahmer marriage finally collapsed. Lionel moved out. Joyce, emotionally unstable and overwhelmed, left home with Jeffrey's younger brother. She didn't ask Jeffrey to come. She didn't check if he had food. She simply left. Jeffrey, 17 years old, was alone in a house that felt more like an abandoned shell than a home. Just weeks later, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, brought him back to the empty house, and killed him. He later said he didn't want Stephen to leave. That simple sentence captured the entire psychology behind his crimes. A desperate, distorted desire to freeze a moment, to stop abandonment, to keep someone from walking away. The next decade was a spiral. Jeffrey bounced between college, the military, and low-wage jobs. He was arrested for indecent exposure, drunkenness, assault. Lionel tried to help paying for rehab, urging him to change, but his efforts came too late. Joyce moved to California and distanced herself from the past. Jeffrey drifted through life with frightening detachment. In 1991, everything hidden inside apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments came into the light. Police found human remains, organs preserved in chemicals, skulls, photographs, evidence of 17 murders committed between 1978 and 1991. The scale of the horror stunned the world. The Milwaukee Cannibal, the monster of Milwaukee. The media invented names because the reality felt too dark to comprehend. But when investigators spoke to Jeffrey, they didn't find a snarling monster. They found a quiet man with flat emotions, someone who described his crimes with an eerie calmness. He said he didn't know how to stop. He said he didn't want his victims to leave him. He said loneliness had consumed him until death became the only way he felt connected to another human being. When the news reached Joyce and Lionel, the world watched them break in real time. Joyce attempted suicide again, but survived. Lionel faced cameras, trembling, trying to explain the unexplainable. He visited Jeffrey in prison, searching for answers. I saw a broken boy in a man's body. He later wrote in his book, A Father's Story, a painfully honest dissection of guilt, denial, and helplessness. Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death by another inmate in 1994, at the age of 34. His parents lived out the rest of their years under the weight of a question no parent ever wants to face. What could we have done differently? Joyce died in 2000 Inches, California, where she had worked with AIDS patients. Lionel lived quietly in Ohio until his death in 2023 at age 87. The Dahmer household wasn't a house of horrors, it was a house of silence. A place where communication broke down, where emotional needs went unmet, where pain festered behind closed doors. A place where a lonely child grew into a man who mistook control for connection, and whose emptiness became deadly. Before Amityville became a brand, before the haunted house movies, the demonic legends, the endless retellings, there was a real family living at 112 Ocean Avenue. A family of 7 inside a beautiful Dutch colonial home with white shutters, trimmed lawns, and the appearance of suburban perfection. But on the night of the 13th of November, 1974, that house became one of the most chilling crime scenes in American history, not because of spirits or demons, but because a 3-year-old man named Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. walked from room to room with a .35 caliber rifle and parents and 4 siblings as they slept. From the outside, Big Ronnie DeFeo seemed like the picture of success. A well-paid service manager at a Brooklyn car dealership owned by his father-in-law, a man who valued appearances, who took pride in providing for his family. But inside the walls of that famous house, his temper ruled everything. Neighbors often heard him berating his wife Louise, shouting through the night, threatening his children. He demanded total obedience. He believed fear was discipline, and discipline was love. Louise, elegant and quiet, tried to maintain the illusion of stability, even as she lived in constant terror. To her children, she was not a protector. She was another victim of Big Ronnie's rage. Their eldest son, Ronald Jr., nicknamed Butch, grew up in this storm of contradictions. He was overweight, bullied at school, fragile in ways his father despised. Big Ronnie tried to toughen him up, which meant psychological whiplash, beatings followed by expensive gifts, affection followed by humiliation, boats, cars, guns, lavish peace offerings, after nights of screaming. The message was unmistakable. Love could be bought, and violence could be forgiven as long as the outside world saw a perfect family. By adolescence, Butch was rebelling. He drank heavily. He experimented with drugs. He threatened coworkers at the dealership. He stole money. Yet no matter how destructive he became, his father refused to cut him off, insisting on keeping the family image intact, no matter how unstable Butch grew. In October 1974, Butch and a friend staged a fake robbery at the dealership, stealing thousands of dollars. When Big Ronnie found out, he exploded, calling his son worthless in front of staff. The humiliation cut deep. Weeks later, Butch told a friend, "If my old man keeps pushing me, I'll kill him, and I'll kill them all." No one took him seriously. They should have. In the early hours of November 13th, while the neighborhood slept, Butch loaded the Marlin rifle. One by one, he entered the bedrooms of his family. He shot his father and mother first, then his two younger brothers, then his sisters. There were no signs of struggle. No one got out of bed. No neighbors heard screams. To this day, investigators still debate how an entire family was killed without anyone waking or trying to escape. After murdering all 6 family members, Butch showered, changed clothes, disposed of the evidence casually, and went to work as if nothing had happened. That evening, he ran into a local bar, shouting that his parents had been shot. Concerned neighbors and police rushed to the house and found all 6 bodies lying in their beds, executed in the same manner. The weapon was found easily. Butch hadn't tried to hide it. At first, he claimed the killing was done by a mob hitman targeting his family. But as detectives questioned him, his story cracked. He contradicted himself. He forgot details. He confessed, finally saying, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." The trial drew national attention. The defense argued insanity, that Butch heard voices, that demons told him to do it, that he had lost control after years of abuse. Prosecutors countered that the motive was rage, resentment, and a lifetime of emotional warfare with his domineering father. Psychiatric evaluations later concluded that Butch suffered from antisocial personality disorder. But he was not legally insane. He was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms. Butch's story changed constantly in the years that followed. Sometimes he claimed his sister Dawn killed his parents, and he killed her in a struggle. Sometimes he blamed his mother. Sometimes he insisted the house was cursed. None of these versions matched the forensic evidence, but his shifting narrative seeded the myth that would become the Amityville Horror. A year after the murders, a new family, the Lutzes, moved into 112 Ocean Avenue and claimed the house was haunted. They described voices, odors, cold spots, even levitation. Their story became a best-selling book, a blockbuster movie franchise, and one of the most famous haunted house legends in the world. But paranormal investigators, skeptics, and even participants later admitted the sensational accounts were exaggerated or fabricated. Still, the legend stuck. And with every retelling, the real victims, the DeFeo family, were overshadowed by a ghost story. Ronald DeFeo Jr. spent nearly 50 years behind bars, offering new explanations every time a reporter called. He died in March 2021 at age 69. He never gave a definitive reason for why he murdered his entire family. And maybe there wasn't one. Maybe it wasn't demons or curses or evil spirits. Maybe it was something far more human and far more common. A house poisoned by fear, a son twisted by abuse and resentment, and a tragedy that had nothing to do with the supernatural and everything to do with the horrors people hide behind closed doors. When we look back at these 10 stories, it's tempting to search for monsters, figures so dark and twisted that they feel separate from the rest of us. But the truth is much harder to face. None of these appeared from thin air. They were shaped by the houses they grew up in, the parents who failed them, the silence that surrounded them, the violence they witnessed, and the wounds no one ever tended to. Every crime we explore began long before a trigger was pulled, before a match was lit, before a life was taken. It began in childhood bedrooms, in dinner table arguments, in overlooked cries for help, and in homes where fear was normal and love was conditional. What these cases reveal is not just the darkness inside individuals, but the darkness families can pass down without meaning to. Neglect becomes resentment. Resentment becomes rage. Rage becomes destruction. and the cycle continues until someone breaks it or becomes consumed by it. If there is anything to learn here, it is this. Evil rarely enters quietly. It grows in the shadows we refuse to confront, and sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones shaped by the people who were supposed to protect them. In the end, these stories aren't just about crime. They're warnings, reminders that what we fail to heal today may return tomorrow in a form we no longer recognize.